So this is a really informal, quick bullet point check, informative range video. There'll be a little bit of detail, largely speaking through what you can see on your screen, just to make sure everything is explained. So quite simply, with range style, as is quite obvious, Death Swiftness is your most important ranged ability. It's what every single range rotation is built around. As such, one of the most important perks and switches in the game for range, and this is a non-negotiable, is having a planted feet switch if you don't have greater death swiftness unlocked. Generally, greater death swiftness isn't advised because it's just expensive, really, when you can just take one switch in your inventory and just get a planted feet switch. Very worth noting that within death swiftness, bleeds are not boosted, so you will definitely want to be prioritising other abilities during your death swiftness. There are some exceptions to this, such as if you're going to do a fragmentation shot that is then walked for double damage. That can of course be used in your death swiftness, but again, it will not boost bleeds. Also worth noting though, however, is the initial main damage of Deadshot is boosted, but the bleed capacity of the ability is not. Should your Relentless proc when you use Death Swiftness, which I see this happen quite frequently and people panic of where to use Adren, use Incendiary Shot straight away and then use your Adrenaline pot, and you'll find yourself having a very comfortable rotation as a result of the crit Adren buff thanks to Incendiary Shot. With the new armor, Dracolich, Rapid Fire becomes your second most important ability, and it is very important to utilize well within your Death Swiftness as well as just in general because of the crit buff it gives. Normal Dracolich will give you a 20% crit buff after using a Rapid Fire, and Elite will give you a 40%. Because of this, we want to use certain abilities afterwards to ensure you get max DPS. My preference is generally it's because I enter an ECB rotation, but I like to use Deadshot and Snapshot in my crit buff, and if I can I'll fit an SGB in. But generally if you are SGB-less and ECB-less, it doesn't particularly matter which thresholds you use during the Dracolich crit buff, as any of them are good. So you just use Snapshot, Deadshot, even like a Dark Bow spec is extremely powerful. Again, as this says here, you may choose to use a Greco during the crit buff, especially if you have the Incense Shot buff, because you might be able to get yourself 70 Adren just from the Greco. And then when you factor in the fact that you could do a Hydrix per Criminal Bolt Greco switch with the Dracolich crit buff, you're almost guaranteed huge Adren from it, assuming you have the Incense Shot. And whilst we're on that topic, crossbow switches to use Criminal Bolts are extremely advised, especially the Hydrix switch. It's such a simple thing, and it's very quality of life if you're using a bow and you have a quiver with, let's say you've got splintering arrows in for your bow and you put Hydrix per Criminal Bolts in. When you switch to your crossbow, it will automatically switch to bolts, and when you switch back to your bow, it will automatically go back to the arrows. So all you have to do is, when Greco's off cooldown, click on your crossbow, use Greco, whether that's manually or with Revolution. You'll get some Adren, up to 70% Adren, it's ridiculous. And then you switch back to your bow and carry on normally. And this is a very simple way to ensure that inside your Death Swiftness rotation and outside of your Death Swiftness rotation, you are maximising the Adren and you are dumping as many thresholds and dark bows and everything as you can. And as much as we all hate Switchscape, it's disgusting. One single crossbow switch, I think we can deal with that. And again, using your Death Swiftness rotation with range will give you huge heals. You will do incredible damage if you commit, and it's very glass cannon, of course it is, which will go more over that in the defensive, but it's risk versus reward, especially if you're using certain familiars like Reaver, which we'll again go over a bit later. But if you're struggling to heal, it generally means that either you're not prayer flicking or you're not following the correct rotation or something like that, or you're not weaving defensives in enough. But generally with range and Death Swiftness, unless you're doing certain bosses like high enrage bosses where you cannot soul split, Your generic bosses, like your even like your Rakshas, you should be able to soul split through a majority of mechanics. Speaking of defensives, these are often ignored, I find, and it's understandable because a lot of the focus is often on, again, your range rotation. But throwing in some defensives will make your life as a ranger much better, because range is the most defensively weak style. Melee has things like Scrimshaw Vampirism, Necromancy has the Ghost, Magic has, you can use Crypt Bloom. Range doesn't have anything. Of course, range can now use Darkness, which is an effective 20% damage reduction, which is fantastic, but that's all it's got. So short version, Debilitate and Reflect, using Bone Shield, of course, so you don't have to switch to a shield, are two of your most important defensives using range. And the way you want to utilise them is, there's very few instances where you want to use them together, because it's not an 100% damage reduction. Of course, it ends up being a 75%, which is okay, but it's a complete waste of adren. And the way you want to use it is, Reflect should always be prioritised over Debilitate 99% of the time, because you reflect damage back. But you use Reflect or Debilitate, keep Soul Split on, and utilise this defensive as a time for you to heal back up and basically save yourself on food. And again, these are becoming incredibly important in a big arrow rotation, where Soul Split is the thing that is non-negotiable. Barricade, don't use it. Unless, again, certain mechanics and certain bosses in certain phases where you have to Cade, or you Cade intercept someone. That's the only instance to use Cade, but it's such an adrenaline loss where you're hindering yourself 99% of the time. And again, Anticipate is something that I see slept on so often. Of course, certain mechanics and bosses you need it to prevent stun. However, Anticipate is an easy 10% damage reduction. If you're getting chomped and you need 10% damage reduction, or you'd benefit from 10% damage reduction, throw in an Anticipate. And Anticipate is coming off the global cooldown soon, whenever that may be. So you'll be able to use it off cooldown whenever you want for a 10% damage reduction and not lose an ability. If you find yourself with too much adren, which is basically impossible with range, use Natural Instinct. And I say this is impossible because you can always dump adren in something like a Dark Bow or a Bolg Spec or something like that. It's not like Necromancy where you almost struggle to get to use adren, because you can't just keep spamming bloat. Resonance is your best friend. Get comfortable with it. The use of Resonance correctly allows you to essentially no food every boss in the game. Disruption Shield, everyone knows about Disruption Shield. It's off global cooldown, so you don't lose an ability, and it lets you negate one attack's damage, so basically you can keep Soul Split on for however long the attacks of the bosses take. Divert, situationally excellent. The only issue with Divert is it puts your Resonance on cooldown, but if you're comfortable with your HP and you want to boost your adren during a rotation, throw Divert in. And again, as it says, Resonance, Divert, Disc Shield, all fantastic to use mid-rotation, as they give you a period of invulnerability to just throw DPS at the boss. Preparation is also an interesting ability, and it's worth looking at in your defensive abilities, because every hit you take, it reduces the cooldown of Divert and Resonance by 3 seconds, I believe. So if you're in a phase where you get hit often, something that comes to mind is the Rain phase, at Solak, and you're struggling with the damage you're receiving, throw in a Preparation and you get an extra Resonance. And that's an extra 1,500 to 3,000 health for free. It's not free, you lose 2 cooldowns, but it's good. Devotion, you already know. The only thing with Devotion to keep in mind is, often at bosses it's all about maximising your Devotion time. The best example of this is at Kerapak hard mode. You want to use Devotion at the correct time in P4, so it extends on when you kill the clones. So the way you'd want to use that in P4 Kerapak is you use the time split shift, the stupid extra action button thing, just before you're about to kill your clone. You use Devotion. you kill the clone, it extends, and then you'll have an extended devotion, which will carry over to when you go back in time, and then you'll have devotion back on cooldown, and you can use it again, and you can get up to 25 seconds of invulnerability to magic, which is incredible because obviously Karapak only attacks with magic. Ammo. This is probably the hardest aspect of range to get into. I mean, just look at this graph. When you look at range and you see there's all different bolts, all different arrows, and a lot of them, the write-ups for them are terrible. One that comes to mind is Wen. The write-ups for Wen on Wiki, and even when you hover over them in game, they're terrible. They're too convoluted. They're too long. But this graph is good because it doesn't explain why to use them, but it tells you the correct arrows to use. So if in doubt, follow this. And a quick rundown. Full is the most powerful arrow on a basic level, and they are the ranger's arrow choice a lot of the time. Quite simply, deal 15% extra damage, but you lose 10% accuracy. And again, very worth noting is they do not buff bleeds. So keep in mind when you're using fulls, especially in a death swiftness rotation, you basically do not want to be using bleeds, because with a combination of fulls and death swiftness, you're doing an extra 65% damage. You do not want to be using part of your death swiftness time on a bleed when you could be using something else and boost its damage by 65%. Knowing when to use fulls is, again, largely down to testing or following this graph, but essentially the best way to do it is, if you want to see if you can use them at a boss, jump into a instance quickly, use a overload, put your prayer on, and see if you have 100% accuracy. Generally, you don't want to be using a sharpshooter aura, as it's not best in slot apart from at 1 or 2 bosses. 99% of the time, Marjora or Reckless or Vampirism, Vampirism in the case of Bix at least, will be preferred. So if you don't have 100% with full, then generally full might not be the arrow to use, because you don't want to be having to use sharpshooter. But yeah, if you get 100% accuracy with fulls, full is the arrow to go to, unless the boss is poisonable, which is where Bic comes in. If the boss fight is anywhere over roughly 2 minutes long, Bic will be your best arrow choice. And the way Bic works is you build up to 200 stacks of Bic arrows on the boss, and each stack boosts your poison damage by 2%. So yeah, 400% extra poison damage, and this becomes incredibly powerful when you build the correct poison build. And this is your Cinderbanes, your Quorm Instance Sticks, your Weapon Poison plus, I can't remember which one's the best one, and Vampirism Aura, and Soul Split. And a quick explanation of the poison build, because it's a bug essentially, so it's a little bit hard to get your head around. But the way it works is, the Reaver's passive effect is every time you heal, the Reaver damages X amount percentage of the damage you've just dealt, basically back on the boss. Or rather, X amount of the damage you healed from Soul Split or Vampirism back on the boss. And every little, 12 damage that you see the Reaver do in their typeless hit damage, it can proc poison. So long story short, if you heal a lot through Soul Split and Vampirism, your Reaver will be doing lots of little attacks, and every little attack has a chance to proc poison. And let's say we've got 400% extra poison damage from Bic arrows, you're going to be hitting 6,500-ish poison damage, potentially each time the Reaver hits. This is why camping Soul Split and Vampirism is so important, and again, this feeds into the Glass Cannon range build, where it's risk versus reward, and it's also is why defensives are so important, and why your Debilitate and Reflect is so important, because you need to be trying to do everything you can to ensure you stay on Soul Split. And the easiest way to do this generally is prayer flicking. Get very comfortable with your prayer flicking, practice it a lot. It's very easy at bosses like Solak, when if you're DPSing you see the little range attack coming towards you, you have time to look at it, time to react. Flick to range, back to Soul Split, Bob's your uncle, you're going to be hitting insane damage with poison. Also very worth noting is how big stacks are generated. Whilst you're building up stacks, you want to be prioritising abilities that hit the boss a lot of times, but this is not, I don't mean bleeds by that. I mean stuff like piercing shot hits twice, Greco with corroming hits 7 times, rapid fire hits 8. So every, look at it, every arrow that hits the boss is building a stack. Bleeds do not add any stacks, but this is not to say, a bit like in Death Swiftness, do not use bleeds. If you're going to do a walked fragmentation shot, etc., then bleeds are okay. But the general go-to for using Bic arrows as a ranger is you want to get to max stacks as quickly as possible. As such, bleeds should definitely not be prioritised. However, when the boss is at max stacks, you want to be using things like bleeds, because every time the bleed hits, it procs a heal on you. Your Reaver procs, it can proc poison. And with this in mind, a general strategy once you've reached max stacks of Bic arrows is switch to fulls to get that 15% extra damage, assuming you keep 100% accuracy, and maintain your stacks by hitting the boss. Stacks reset every 30 seconds, so hit the boss more frequently than 30 seconds with your Bic arrows, essentially. When get in the bin, we don't care. The only time I've ever seen them used is as a switch for a single threshold at Kerapak. Too much effort, switch escape, nope. Jazz, very easy. If the enemy is a dragon or demon, use jazz arrows. I suppose as a quick example of a rotation I would do, because using Dracolich is potentially a little bit confusing at first, is, so I've got my, this is ugly, isn't it? So I've got my corroming Greco switch here. I apparently don't have any armour, this is good. So the way I'd start is, if I didn't have greater death swiftness, I would start by equipping a bow that has planted feet. I would use my death swiftness, I would switch to a crossbow with corroming, and make sure my Hydrix bolts are equipped. And this is just an example. Hydrix bolts equipped when I've got my crossbow. As soon as I put my bow on, I'm back on Bics, back on Hydrix back bolts, and it's worth keybinding your arrow switches to get comfortable with them, just so you can do them manually if needs be. So yes, we'd start off by doing a planted feet death swiftness, and then we'd switch to a crossbow with corroming, put your Hydrix back bolts on. We're going to Greco, and unfortunately didn't proc that time, but that's fine. We'll switch back to that, and we'll start our rotation. And then we're going to switch back to that. We're going to Greco, and we're going to build with your rapid fire. And you'll see the crit buff come up soon. Yeah, there it is. We can do that. And long story short, keep doing that. Use your thresholds. If you've got limitless, it helps, of course. But utilise that crit buff to just hit hard. But my main thing as a ranger, or any style really, to try and get used to is your Greco Hydrix switches. Because I'll try and get one to proc, but 29% adren, up to 51. And this 1% additional adrenaline from basic abilities works on every style. So you'll be seeing incredible gains, and if you use your rapid fire during it, you'll get, well, I get 3% adren per rapid fire hit. You get a little bit less with normal Dracolich. But yes, Greco Hydrix switches, incredible. Get used to them, they're brilliant. But that's range really. Yeah, cool. Hope this helps.